Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Ezekiel chapters 40 through 48, where Ezekiel speaks of the new temple. In our journey through Ezekiel so far, and we're coming to the very last several chapters. The first section was oracles against Judah, and you had Ezekiel's calls, and then judgment in the temple, and judgment, pictures of judgment, a lot of judgment in that section, judgment against Judah. And then God turns from Judah to oracles against the nations, all those nations that surrounded Judah. They're not going to get off free. But now we come to the turning point. Now, instead of judgment, we're going to see oracles of salvation, beginning with a call for a watchman to look out for God's salvation. He's coming. He's going to do some wonderful things. And then promises of restoration, chapters 34 through 37. Included in that is that section about the valley of the dry bones that come to life. And it's a picture of how the nation of Israel is going to come to life. But then after that, there is this battle sequence, almost apocalyptic in its description of Gog and Magog, and they come down against Israel, but God steps in and they are defeated. And now we have this picture of the new temple. Chapter 40 and verse 1, in the 25th year of our exile, it is 25 years now that Ezekiel has been in the area of Mesopotamia since he's been removed from the land, along with the 10,000 craftsmen that were removed with him. At the beginning of the year, on the 10th of the month, in the 14th year after the city was taken, so 25 years earlier, they had been brought to Mesopotamia, but 14 years earlier, they had heard about the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, and that's already taking place now as we read this. In the 14th year after the city was taken, on the same day, the hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me there. Where? He brought him to Jerusalem. Let's look at that. Verse 2, in the visions of God, he brought me into the land of Israel and set me on a very high mountain, and on it to the south there was a structure like a city. Now he's going to see something that will be not the destroyed ruins of Jerusalem. He's taken, as it were, not literally, but in a vision, to see what Jerusalem could and should look like. Where there's a structure, and notice it's called a structure like a city. Now, as we get into the description of the structure, we're going to look at it. We're going to say, well, gee, I see the city, but I also see the temple. Is it a temple or is it a city? Because it says here it's like a city. And my answer is yes. It's a city slash temple. How can that be? Well, we're going to see that. Verse 3, so he brought me there, and behold, there was a man whose appearance, and again, his appearance was like the appearance of bronze. Doesn't mean that he was made of bronze, but he looked like that, with a line of flax and a measuring rod in his hand, and he was standing in the gateway. Verse 4, the man said to me, Son of man, see with your eyes, hear with your ears, and give attention to all that I am going to show you, for you have been brought here in order to show it to you. Declare to the house of Israel all that you see. You see, Israel is having this vision, but they're going to be told about the vision. So he is going to verbally describe it, even as we're reading it. It's being pictured for us in very highly descriptive language so that we can visualize it. Now, here's our outline. This is actually compliments of David Dorsey. Did a great job of pointing out the structure, the literary structure. We begin chapters 40 through 42 with a measurement of the temple, and then we see in chapter 43 the arrival of the glory of God from the east. And we're going to look at that and pay special attention to how God's glory arrives from the east. And then there are a series of regulations, chapters 43, the rest of chapter 43 and on into chapter 44. And then in chapter 45, there are measurements taken, specific measurements. Then we have more temple regulations. So we notice two sets of regulations. Then we'd had the departure of, or I'm sorry, the arrival of the glory of God from the east. Now we have the departure, not of the glory of God, he's there to stay, but the departure of the river from the temple to the east. So the river is going to be flowing out from the temple, and it's going to be not just a little trickle, it's going to be a big river. Not just a big river, it's going to be a river that's so big you cannot wade across the river. You'd have to jump in and swim. And then finally, we're going to see the measurement, not of the temple, we already saw that, but now the measurement of the land of Israel. And the vision will close on that note. Now, as we look at this vision, it's striking when we look from our New Testament perspective and see John's revelation, his vision of the New Jerusalem in Revelation chapters 21 and 22. And I want to suggest there's a connection that when you come to the book of Revelation, you're supposed to say, oh, I remember that. That was in the book of Ezekiel. So that Ezekiel is taken in this vision, we already looked at that verse, to a very high mountain. John's vision likewise starts off where John is carried in the Spirit to a great and high mountain. In Ezekiel's vision, a man uses a rod to measure the dimensions of the temple. In John's vision, an angel measures the city with a rod. In Ezekiel's vision, the entire temple area is a perfect square. We're going to see those dimensions. In John's vision, in the book of Revelation, the entire city is a perfect cube. That is, both its length and its width, as well as its height, is all the same measurement, very big. Now, in the book of Revelation, unfortunately, at least my translation translates it into miles, and it's like, I don't know, something like 1,500, 1,300, 1,500 miles, lots of miles. But unfortunately, and now I'm not saying that's incorrect, that's okay, but you miss the symbolism because in the book of Revelation, it's 12,000 stadia. That is its height and its width and its length. And you're supposed to catch the 12,000 part because that represents something. And also when you look at that description, that shape, where its height and its width and its depth are all the same, so that cubical shape, you are supposed to remember that that shape was seen back in the Old Testament. It was seen in the Holy of Holies, because the Holy of Holies was the dimensions, whether you're talking about the tabernacle or then later on Solomon's temple, where everything was twice as big as the tabernacle, but still the dimensions were the same shape, and that was the Holy of Holies, its height and its width and its depth. And notice, so the temple is described in those terms, but then the entire city is the Holy of Holies. You're supposed to pull that out of the book of Revelation. We continue. Ezekiel's vision, you have the presence of the glory of God that enters the temple. We're going to see that in chapter 43. In John's Revelation, there's no need of the sun or moon because the Lord illumines the city. He is there. He has come into the city. In Ezekiel's vision, no foreigner is admitted into the temple. In John's Revelation, nothing unclean, and no unbeliever is allowed into the city. In Ezekiel's vision, a river of water flows out of the temple. Big river of water. You can't wade across it. It's so big. In the New Jerusalem, a river of the water of life comes from the throne of God. In Ezekiel's vision, there are a total of 12 gates around the city. In John's Revelation, there are 12, I'm sorry, yes, around the city. There's 12 gates to the city in the book of Revelation. In Ezekiel's vision, the name of the city shall be the Lord is there. And you read in Revelation chapter 22, verse 3, the throne of God shall be there. And so what we have here is a picture of the book of Revelation, a city. In Ezekiel, it's a city slash temple, and it's the same place. It's the same vision. And now in Ezekiel chapter 43, verse 1, he led me to the gate facing toward the east. And remember, this is Jerusalem. And behold, the glory of the God of Israel was coming from the way of the east. You remember how back in Ezekiel chapters 8, 9, 10, and 11, you'd had throughout those chapters, the glory of God was leaving Jerusalem because of its sinfulness. It had originally been there in the Holy of Holies in the temple, and then it came out to the doorway of the temple, and then it went out to the doorway of the outer courts, and then it left the city and went out to the mountain on the east, the Mount of Olives. But now we see the opposite movement where the glory of the God of Israel is coming here from the way of the east, from which it had departed, and his voice was like the sound of many waters. That is, it's a loud sound. Think waterfall sound. And the earth shone with his glory. God is coming back into his temple. Verse 3, and it was like the appearance of the vision which I saw, like the vision which I saw when he came to destroy the city. Remember back early in the book of Ezekiel. And so he's seen again the vision of the presence of God, and the visions were like the vision which I saw by the river Kabar, and I fell on my face. And Ezekiel has come full circle back to the temple, back to the presence of God, returning to the city. Verse 4, and the glory of the Lord came into the house by the way of the gate facing toward the east. And the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court. And behold, the glory of the Lord filled the house. God is seen returning to the building. Now we jump down to verse 10, chapter 43, verse 10. As for you, son of man, this is God speaking to Ezekiel, describe the temple to the house of Israel. All these descriptions that we read about in this chapter, Ezekiel is to describe them. Notice the purpose clause. In order that they may be ashamed of their iniquities and let them measure the plans. And so we have here the purpose of the vision. The purpose of the vision is to incite a response on the part of the hearers of the vision. That is the Jewish people that are right now exiles back in Mesopotamia near Babylon by the river Kabar. And they're to hear this, and they are to be ashamed of what they have done, is to point out their sinfulness and bring them full circle, but also that they might measure the plan. Verse 11, if they are ashamed of all they've done, and that's presumed hopefully to be the case, make known to them the design of the house, its structure, its exits, its entrances, all its designs, all its statutes, and all its laws, and write it in their sight, which we have here in the book of Ezekiel, it's written, so that they may observe its whole design and all its statutes and do them. The purpose of this vision is that they might hear, repent, and now begin to obey. Obey in repenting and following the Lord. And when they come back into the land, they're going to make this happen. They're going to respond in obedience when God calls them to rebuild, and He will. He's going to say in the book of Haggai and Zechariah, He's going to say, time to start rebuilding. Of course, they already had started by then, but they had paused. And God's going to come and say, why are you still in your paneled houses when God's temple isn't finished yet? Go finish it. And they're going to do that. Now, chapter 44 and verse 1, then he brought me back by the way of the outer gate of the sanctuary, which faces the east, and it was shut. Now, this is the eastern gate. What you're looking at here is the eastern gate, although the eastern gate, even in Jesus' day, let alone Ezekiel's day, in Jesus' day, it was actually lower than this. This eastern gate's actually built on top, right over top of an older gate that goes back to an earlier age. So that you're looking at actually construction from the Crusader period, perhaps, yeah, probably around the Crusaders, maybe a little bit earlier than that. But still, notice he's brought to this eastern gate, and it's shut. And by the way, it's shut today. Notice how it's walled shut. Verse 2, the Lord said to me, this gate shall be shut, it shall not be opened, and no one shall enter by it, for the Lord God of Israel has entered by it. You remember how somebody entered by it? Well, first of all, we've just read about the Lord leaving and then coming back through the eastern gate. That is, he had left in that vision back in his early part of Ezekiel. Now we see him in the vision coming back. But this is also the gate, I think, by which Jesus came into the city. And so it's not just the Lord in the days of Ezekiel, but I think we're also supposed to see there was something special about this gate because Jesus came in through this gate into the temple in his triumphal entry. And therefore, it shall be shut. Verse 3, as for the prince, he shall sit in it as prince to eat bread before the Lord. He shall enter by way of the porch of the gate and shall go out by the same way. Now, I'm told there's a legend. I don't know if the legend's really true. I haven't really tried to track it down, but that one of the Muslim rulers, after Islam had come on the scene, that one of the Muslim rulers ordered that a cemetery be placed there outside the gate so as to stop the Lord, specifically, I think he was thinking the Messiah, from entering. He didn't want any Jewish Messiah to come into the city. And so he thought, well, I'll just desecrate it. I'll put a graveyard there, all these bodies and unclean burials and things like that, um, forgetting the fact that when Jesus comes back, there's going to be a resurrection. The graves are going to be open. That which was unclean will have been cleansed. Now, how are we to understand these chapters? How are we to look at this? It's obviously a vision for the rebuilding of the temple, and we've already seen where Ezekiel says this. He's given this by God in order to motivate the people for holy living, but also for holy building when they finally come back into the land. And of course, within just a couple of generations, they would be back in the land and they would begin the process of rebuilding. And they would have this outline. You say, well, gee, did they follow that outline completely? There's parts of it I see, parts of it I don't really see. Well, no, I don't think they did. I think they tried, but there were some parts that were just not up to their ability to build. And so it's perhaps the result is perhaps a little bit less than that. For example, by the time we get to New Testament period, they had actually built aqueducts, bringing water to the temple so that you could have a river. It wasn't this big giant river that you couldn't wade across, but that you would have water flowing from the temple. Now, like I said, it wasn't this big giant river. I think you see that in more. For example, you see a river described in the book of Revelation. Is that literal or is that symbolic? Well, we'll ask that in a second. You see, there is a picture here. There's imagery, there's symbolism here of God who is going to dwell with his people. Jesus did that. John chapter 1 and verse 14 talks about how the Word became flesh and dwelled among us. I love the Greek word there. He tabernacled among us. And so the question comes up, are we to take these chapters as symbolic, or are we to take them as literal? Are they something that the Jewish people were supposed to do back then? Is it something that's going to, we're still looking at in the future? And my answer is yes, in a sense, to all of it. You see, they were to rebuild it. And they went through a number of rebuilding processes, both in the days of Zerubbabel when they first came back into the land, and then they added to that later on in the days of the Hasmonean kings. We think of them as the Maccabees, and then even more so when Herod the Great came along, and you had the temple completely restructured and rebuilt into this grand and glorious vision. But it was also symbolic. It was a picture of Jesus, who stood in that same temple and who said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And then John tells us, John chapter 2 and verse 19, that he was speaking of the temple of his body that would go to the cross and die for us, that would in essence be destroyed and buried, and that would rise again for us. And so this whole section comes to a close. Ezekiel chapter 48, verse 36, the very last verse of the entire book. And the name of the city from that day shall be, the Lord is there. Because God will dwell with his people.